Okay.
Hi, today I'm sitting down with Steve Brandt, and we're going to be talking about a recent opinion piece that he had in the Star Tribune. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, I'm Steve Brandt. I have lived in the Kingfield neighborhood of Ward 8 for 49 years this coming fall, and raised a couple kids there, and have been active in the neighborhood. Worked at the Star Tribune as a reporter for 40 years, retired about 8 years ago, and that freed me to get political.
Okay, I don't think I realized you're a reporter for 40 years. Wow. Where do you, this not the main topic, but the Star Tribune has changed a lot. Any thoughts on those changes?
Well, I went out biking this morning with the guy who lays out the front page, and I probably spent 20 minutes giving him an earful. It's hard to see. I mean, the paper is obviously making a transition from print to digital, and they're starting to starve the print product, and it's sad to see for those of us who grew up with it, but digital is the wave of the future, and there are things you can do with that you can't do otherwise. After being gone only 8 years, the number of people I know at the paper has dwindled sharply.
Yeah. Well, I've written about sort of the dearth of local coverage, right? So
Right.
If you want to find out what happened at the latest city council meeting, or God forbid a committee meeting, or even some of these forums, it's hard to find news about it.
Absolutely, because you have fewer reporters stretched over the same amount of bandwidth. So they can't get to as many things as people are traditionally used to them getting to. I think it's good that we have a lot of community voices, but some of the community newspapers are going through the same issues, or they're switching to websites, and that's a good thing because I think it allows them to cut down the cost of entry because you can go online for much less investment than paying for ink and paper. And you have to sort of curate who you listen to according to the degree of care that they put into vetting what they're writing. One thing you got with the Star Tribune was that you knew that people had talked on both sides of the issue. Some folks today mistake journalism for writing a personal essay, but and that's okay as long as you know what it is. But you have to be aware of those sorts of things, and the more voices out there, the better.
Well, certainly the new technology gave me this platform to write my newsletter and do the podcast. And my newsletter, as you are probably aware, is not like straight journalism. There's certainly some evaluation that goes on there, and some personal anecdotes that I hope makes it a little bit more interesting. Things that you really wouldn't do in a standard newspaper, right?
Right. You've got a lot more personality in what you're writing, and that's good.
Well, great. So, but you have another job now. You entered politics, and tell us about that.
Well, I am a member of, directly elected by the public, one of two, on the city's Board of Estimate and Taxation, and that is a body that has roots in the 19th century when it was known as the Board of Tax Levy, and it was an effort to coordinate the city, what the city taxed, with what the schools taxed, with what the county taxed, and much of the county's tax base back then, of course, was in Minneapolis, and also in that mix were the library board and the park board. And so about 100 years ago, just over 100 years ago, there was sort of a groundswell of opinion that the city council at the time was not doing very well at setting the budget. It was 26 members, all of whom served part-time, and the budget was sort of a hodgepodge of what they pulled together. And so the newspapers at the time editorialized about the need for a better, more professional approach to budgeting. And the legislature, I think at the instigation of the Hennepin County delegation, which was more dominant back in those days, sort of recreated the Board of Tax Levy as the Board of Estimate and Taxation. And we have two essential functions now, but the law that created us had more functions at the time, including a much broader budget review. Now we really don't, we ask questions about the budget, but we don't set the budget. The two powers we do have are, one is setting how much the property tax can go up each year in percentage terms, and what we set as the limit, the mayor and city council have to live beneath, and they can set it much lower, or they can set it at the limit we approve. Last year, they came down a couple percentage points in the end. And the other thing we do is authorize not any borrowing, but most borrowing by the city that's backed by the property tax. And so coming along with that, we do look at various quarterly reports on the budget to see how revenues and spending are balancing, and that's broken down by a number of different funds, the general fund being the most important, but there's also ones that are concentrated on downtown Minneapolis, for example, that are funded mainly by the sales and special taxes the city collects.
So I want to jump in and ask you a couple questions there, because that's a lot. First of all, I can't believe there used to be 26 city councilors.
Up until, I think, the early 50s.
Okay.
And I should mention that in the 1920s, about a third of the council was indicted for various corruption charges by Floyd Olson because essentially they were vulnerable to political influence and handing out favors and contracting. I think they were much more in charge of a fiefdom in their individual wards at that time.
So do you know how they went from 26 to 13, how that number got picked?
I think they just cut the number of council members. There were 13 wards, I believe, but they cut the number of council members to one for each ward.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So you said that the BET was what kind of your acronym, right? Sets the levy. Now, how does that work? Because, the council and mayor try and agree on a budget, and that gets sent to you. But do you already have an idea before that gets sent to you of what the tax should be? Or does their budget, do you look at the budget and say, to cover everything here, we need to raise property taxes
Actually,
X?
it sort of works the way you described second. The mayor proposes a budget. We don't propose a budget, and we don't get to vote on how the money's spent other than when we vote for various borrowing things that are part of the capital program. The mayor proposes a budget, and the first step for that budget is to come to the Board of Estimate in September, and we look at the percentage that he proposes, and we can go higher, we can go lower. And then once we set that figure, it goes back to the mayor, or actually the council, and the council gives the budget a fair amount of scrutiny, and it goes, and they agree on a figure, and they negotiate maybe with the mayor for both spending and the property tax, but it has to be within the limit we set. And then it's approved, and except for last year when it was vetoed by the mayor, that's the adoption of the budget for the following year.
Okay.
So it's a process that takes from August, really, when it becomes public as a proposed tax increase and proposed budget, until September, early September, when it's adopted.
Do you have any idea what it's going to be this year? Because I know last year the mayor said it would probably be like 9.3% increase.
I think that's looking ahead to 2026. That's what's roughly in the 5-year financial direction that the city council adopts each year as part of the budget. And I've already been looking at various parts of the city budget, looking for money to suggest to the mayor that he use to bring that figure down. For example, right now we have a fairly substantial a fairly substantial budget reserve, and you need to have a budget reserve. The city's long-term policy has been that the budget reserve should be at least 17% of the budget, and that's because much of the money that the city takes in comes in two big swallows when we pay our first half and second half property taxes. So you need that sort of cushion. But I think there is some money there that could be used to buy down the property tax increase next year. And then there are also in the, essentially the fund, the Downtown Assets Fund, which is where all the sales tax collected in the city and the special taxes we pay, things like restaurant and liquor taxes, lodging taxes, admission taxes, that all goes into that fund, and that is running a very healthy balance. I think it's up about 20 million over what it was a year ago, and that seems to me like a logical place. The city budget has been, the city's general fund, which is what most people think of when they think of the city budget, is about 600 and 700 million, and we can pull money in from the Downtown Assets Fund from those special revenues, and those revenues can then buy down the cost of a tax increase. And it's been as high as 31 million being shifted from the sales and special taxes to the general fund.
When was that?
It was just before the pandemic.
Okay.
Yeah, so it took a big nosedive during the pandemic, and now the fund is healthy again, believe it or not.
So that's probably to people going out downtown and eating and.
Well, part of it is, we never stop consuming throughout the whole city. So the sales tax we pay when we go to the hardware store or whatever continued to be collected, and there was a lot of remodeling going on during the pandemic, as you recall. But the recovery has been more on the entertainment, the Twins, the Timberwolves drive that, and so that's where the recovery has come.
And there's been some talk of expanding that downtown district tax ticket, right?
That's correct. If you look at it, the map, which is online under the State Department of Revenue site, the downtown boundaries that are shown there are pretty good approximation of what people thought of as downtown maybe 30, 40 years ago. And a prime example of the change has been the North Loop. Only about a third of the North Loop south of the railroad track, where the railroad tracks cross under Washington Avenue, is in the district. So that means the area, the 2/3 of the North Loop that has developed as entertainment since then, doesn't pay into the fund, and that creates a sort of competitive imbalance between the bars and restaurants in that part of the city and the ones that are closer to the center of the city.
So would they ever consider, instead of just, I don't know how much that downtown tax is right now, is it 1% or?
I believe it's 3% for liquor and restaurant, and there's various other add-ons. Sometimes they add on to your bill, and sometimes it's one or the other.
Okay. So, but I'm guessing what they'll do is just extend the 3% to that North Loop, as opposed to, say, dropping the tax to 2% because now they're adding extra area. Is that
actually what I have seen at the legislature does cut the rate? I'm not sure I agree with that, because I think we're in a mode right now where the city needs the additional revenue if we're going to avoid piling any additional spending onto the property tax. So I would prefer to see it extended at 3%, but it may not end up that way.
Okay, well, so that's all kind of a good segue into your opinion piece that was in the Star Tribune. Minneapolis needs revenue, and it needn't all come from property taxes. Would you just give me a quick rundown of your idea and? Sure.
Well, the city budget obviously increases every year. We can argue whether it's too much or too little, but it goes up just like any expense in your household does. And the problem with that is right now the property tax is really the only discretionary source of revenue that the city has. So it becomes a shock absorber of first and last resort when there's a budget increase. And I favor a serious look at city spending, but it's a question as to whether that falls under the board's purview or not. It's certainly not mentioned in the charter, but we are doing, I'm advocating for some other things that aren't in the charter as well. But my concept is we have the sales and special taxes, and those are fairly steady except for when there's a big recession or a pandemic. And then we have a lot of income from permit fees and licenses, and generally you can't set those at more than the cost that you can justify doing a cost analysis of the cost to regulate that business.
Speaking of those, I was a little shocked. I was looking at different funds in the state, and this doesn't impact the city, but I want to say like the DNR duck fund was like huge. I couldn't believe it. Like, so they're obviously collecting a good deal of money and licenses for like duck hunting and other, licenses. But,
and of course, the state doesn't live by the same rules that cities have to live by in many cases. And that's a statewide fund. And so the property tax is really the area where if the council wants to spend more, or if it feels like it needs to be spending more to be prudent, to keep up city services, the property tax is where they turn. And so my idea is that we look at alternatives to that. And the one that makes the most sense to me, but I'm certainly willing to listen to other people's ideas, is a low rate city income tax that would only apply to higher earner households. And the reason I favor that is because administratively it would be fairly simple compared to setting up a bureaucracy to do a payroll tax or to do a wealth tax. You would essentially have, as I envision it, a line on your state income tax form that says if you live in Minneapolis, add 1 or 2%, and then the state would collect that and remit it to the city, and the city would have that revenue. So I see that as a way to blunt the increases in the property tax, mitigate them, and I would love to have it be devoted to that purpose. I think if nothing else, it would reduce the increase in the property tax. We obviously have a lot of issues in terms of the city's finances that are created by the federal administration's cuts in various forms of aid, which not only affect the city directly, but also flow through the state and then to the city. And so it's possible that if we want to keep the services we have, we might have to use some of that income tax revenue for this. Now, I should hasten to add that I'm just a guy on the Board of Estimate and Taxation, which doesn't have the power to implement a tax like this. City Council doesn't have the power to implement it either, but we, as a city, at the City Council, could add it to its annual legislative program and ask the legislature, which has the power, to do that. And I don't think it's too likely until there's another election and we see if the legislature goes more Republican, goes back to being heavily Democratic. But I think that would be the opportunity. And so I'm arguing that we should right now be doing the due diligence to look at where is this being used, what are the pluses, what are the minuses, if any, and have a well thought out proposal ready for the legislature.
So let's pull some of that apart. So you're thinking 1% on total family incomes over 200,000, right? So not individuals, but everyone in the house, right?
Everyone
or if
in
you
the
file
house.
jointly or something.
Yeah.
Okay. And then
And the figure is negotiable.
Right.
And I'm thinking 1%. and that would yield a minimum of 40 million in my calculations.
So you mentioned in here that that Elliott Payne and the mayor and stuff kind of agreed that they would undertake a serious study of the feasibility of alternative taxes. So is that happening, or like what other alternatives has this group kind of talked about besides?
The Board of Estimate really hasn't discussed this as a concentrated sort of approach. And I think the preference of the mayor and the council president would be to do it within their respective domains. The council now has a research arm. I'm told it's overloaded, but presumably by 2027 legislative session, they should be able to give it a thorough vetting. We have a number of studies that have been done of local income taxes. They're employed in 5,000 local jurisdictions, not just cities, but they can be school districts, they can be special taxing jurisdictions. And so we have the experience in both red states and blue states. And so we would, and the mayor also has a finance department that could presumably be brought to bear as well.
So, and what has been the result in those other cities? Because I feel like I hear a lot of people not just moving out of a city, but out of an entire state. Like, so a lot of people say moving from California to Texas or Florida to avoid taxes. I mean, is that, you kind of mentioned that, I think, in your piece. Is that something to worry about?
It's something we need to be looking at and be aware of what has been the experience of other places. I think that's more likely at the state level, that people would move to a different state. It's possible we may lose some people to other places that don't have an income tax. People have told me that maybe doing it on an individual city basis might be difficult, but I think that we don't know until we study what's happened elsewhere in a situation that's more similar to Minneapolis, at the center of a governmentally fragmented metro area. And I've heard people, there are people who have, in all the reaction I've gotten to this, I've only had one person say, he was already in the suburbs, so he wasn't going to leave. But another fellow said he would at least think about it, and I understand that. If you want to turn your back on, the great city parks and lakes and so on, and the great services we have in terms of solid waste, where we pay one fee and we don't pay for every leaf bag that gets picked up. That's certainly people's privilege. The question is, if that happens, will people fill in behind those people who are moving up, looking for move-up housing, and may want to live on a big house by the lake? Right.
And so why did you choose the 200,000? I know you said it's negotiable, but some people I've talked to since they read that have thought, wow, 200,000 is too low, because if you have kids and you're paying tuition, or maybe you have elder care, or it kind of sounds like a lot, but depending on your expenses, it may not be.
Okay. Well, my idea was to try and spare the folks who are now suffering most under the property tax burden. The median city household income is about $80,000, and so this is 2.5 times that. I have heard some comments to the same effect that you have, so that's why it's negotiable. I think that there are tax credits for some of the things that you have mentioned, like elder care or child care and so on. And we have to sort that through, and that's why I want this thing to be thoroughly vetted. But I think it makes more sense than potentially a payroll tax, although I'm open to that idea. But a payroll tax could drive business out and jobs out, and so that's another thing that could be in the mix, but I think all these ideas need careful vetting.
Right. So you've gotten some feedback then. Have you gotten any feedback from mayor or council members or anything like that?
Well, both, other than the mayor and the council president saying that they would both like to diversify the city's revenues, the talk is always vague, and I thought putting some ideas on the table would generate some discussion and maybe get some momentum for one idea or another. I got a lot of reaction at the 2 DFL ward conventions I was at last weekend. As you might guess,
You're very mellow about that. I got a lot of reactions. I mean,
it was good reaction.
Okay, all right.
As you might expect from a DFL convention, and a third event I went to that day that was party affiliated. Obviously, there are lots of people in the city who aren't DFLers, and one would have to listen to everybody. But one of the people I've been working on this idea with is a person who's much better educated on sort of the revenue side of things on a big picture scale, and that's Dane Smith, who is a former leader of the Growth and Justice think tank that worked for both of those two things. And he's provided me with some of the research he's found, and has given me the confidence to move ahead with this idea.
So I think one of the reactions that people may have is, why can't they control spending? Like, Why do we need to raise more money? Isn't there a way to control spending? I mean, do you feel like that's under consideration, or is it just assumed that spending goes up?
I'd like to see it be under consideration. We don't have a line in the charter that says that the Board of Estimate and Taxation reviews the budget, either on an annual basis or on a more systemic basis. I think that the need for review of city spending can be summarized this way. It used to be that many of the city's services were property affiliated, and so the property tax made sense. Now we're seeing a lot greater breadth of city spending in areas that were not as traditionally the area that the city had purview over or ventured into. Source of revenue in order to fund those things, or should we fund those things, or should we fund something else? And it's certainly a discussion that is good to have, no matter what the type of spending is. St. Paul recently did an outside review, had an outside review of its spending, and I'm more familiar with the overall conclusions. I haven't dived into the deeper analysis of the areas of where the spending has grown, but I think there are people in Minneapolis who could certainly help us to try to review city spending, just looking for patterns and what generalizations can we make. Are there things that we once did that we no longer need to do?
So,
for example, just to follow up on that, well, go ahead.
Well, I think it's a fantastic idea, and I was just going to ask you more about that, like who was involved in that St. Paul examination, and then when you say that you can think of some people that could be involved here, what is it? Who would you choose?
I don't have individuals in mind in Minneapolis as much as I can tell you who was involved in St. Paul. I can tell you generically. But in St. Paul, a developer, John Manillo, who's been a critic over the years of City Hall, was involved. But there was also a former city budget director who was involved. Dave Beal, who's a pretty smart, thoughtful, a former business editor of the St. Paul newspaper, was involved, and so people who had an outside understanding of were outside the city but had an understanding of the budget. In Minneapolis, I think there are lots of people I can think of who would have things to contribute. Some of them are former city budget directors themselves. We have people with budgeting experience. We have the Federal Reserve. I think that would be a prime example of where you might draw some analytical talent. And the university obviously has some pretty smart people in public finance. And those are the sorts of folks I'd like to see get involved.
Can the city ask the Federal Reserve to do that? Because it's on my to-do list right now to read the Federal Reserve review of the basic income pilot that the city did, and that was done by the Federal Reserve. So how do you engage them to say, hey, come look at city spending, look at the patterns, and report on it?
I don't know anybody right now at the Federal Reserve in Minneapolis, but I do know that they have a fairly public-focused mission and like to do research as a value to the areas that they serve, and they're based in Minneapolis. So I would like to, I would love to see them involved, and I think you need to come together as a group, lay out a research program, and then do the research, and then do the analysis, and then come up with conclusions.
So are you thinking you're going to start a group, or are you looking for help for this? Or
here's what I'm thinking right now. I'm running for re-election. It takes a lot of time, in addition to my board duties. If nothing has emerged by the time we're sworn into a second term, then I think we raise the issue. The question is, do I do it as a private citizen? Do I recruit better people to do it and lead it, since I'm sort of in some ways an insider? Then the question is, can we use the new staffer that we'll be hiring at the Board of Estimate and Taxation, which is a restoration of a position that existed for about 100 years until about 5 years ago, to do some of that research. And I don't know how the board would feel about that, but I think that I've heard Council President Payne and Budget Chair Chugtai both talk very favorably about the need to look for additional sources of revenue, and I would think this would be part of that analysis.
Can I throw out a couple ideas?
Sure.
So one of the things that Santa Cruz, California did that I thought was interesting is they imposed either a 5 or a 10 cent fee onto every sugary drink that was sold in the city. Would something like that be an option, as opposed to, I don't know if that would raise as much as a 1% income tax, probably not, but
whatever the legislature allows us is feasible. There are other ideas that are out there.
What are a few of those?
Well, for example, we could take the existing property tax and redistribute how it's applied. Now, that would probably have to be done statewide, but there is precedent for it. In other words, you take the first X number of dollars of a home's value, and you convert that from assessed value or estimated market value to tax capacity, which is what the tax rate is actually applied to. Say we did that at 1%, and then, which is the current rate for homes generally. And then we could take the next tier of, say, 200,000, so we're getting up to 300,000 now, and tax that at 1.5 or 2. And then when we get above 400 or 500,000, we could up the percentage more. But generally, that would have to be done on a statewide basis. There is precedent for it.
And would that only impact homeowners, or would that apply to like rental properties too?
It would only apply to homeowners. Right now, there is something that helps. Well, there's several things that help renters, but one is the state's 4D program, where a landlord agrees to rent certain units at a certain level that qualifies for the state help, and then they get a break on their property tax.
So here's another idea that I've seen where, and I guess, of course, this would take, yeah, I'm sure this all takes the state legislature, right? Like, so the city of Minneapolis itself can't add taxes.
We're,
That's correct.
no, we're a creature of the state.
Right. But this idea that there's a different tax rate if you own a second home that's not, your main residence. Any thoughts on that one?
I don't see how. I'm philosophically in favor of it. I own a cabin in Wisconsin, and I pay more there, and that's fair.
And that helps Wisconsin, or
Yeah, it helps Wisconsin, right?
Yeah,
it would help Minnesota if it were in Minnesota, but I think that that's unlikely to have any benefit to Minneapolis because it would go to the local jurisdiction where the cabin or second home is located. Yeah.
Okay. So, I'm just wondering through this whole conversation, the need to have the extra money, does that mean we should be concerned that the city of Minneapolis's finances aren't in order, I guess, or out of whack? I mean, you gave me some insights. We're talking about how the downtown fund is doing well and it's over 20 million, but then in your opinion piece, you also brought up, possible federal cuts that could hurt this city. So I'm trying to get a picture of, are we worried or trying to head off worries, or, what picture I should have of city finances?
Let me say, first of all, that the city of Minneapolis's finances are well managed, and I don't take credit for that. We have a professional finance staff, and the real test of that is our credit rating. When we go to borrow money, we have the highest rating from all three credit rating agencies, and that means that we're doing a good job. However, every jurisdiction, whether it has good credit or bad credit, I think it's prudent to be wary of what may be coming from the federal government, just because of the kind of proposals we've seen so far. So that wasn't the stimulus for thinking of additional revenues, but it certainly adds to the urgency.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But it would take probably, you said, a couple of years to vet this idea and get it through the state legislature. And so if it goes through the state, like, who would be the eventual approver of it? If the state says you're allowed to do it, would this come back to the mayor and the city council, and they would still have to incorporate it into the budget and agree to it? Or
correct. The mayor and city council, or at least the city council, would need to put it in the city's legislative program. That goes to the legislature. The legislature acts on it, modifies it, or rejects it. And then it comes back if it's approved, and the city council would implement it.
Okay. So you mentioned that you spoke about this idea at a couple of conventions. Are you going to be out and about this coming weekend talking about it more, or what's?
I have 5 conventions this weekend spread over 2 days, including my own. So yes, I will be out and talking to people.
Okay. All right. Well, that's great. And then I'm sure you'll get lots of more feedback. Thank you for taking the time to ride your bike here and talk to me. Are there any other topics or issues about the article that you wanted to bring up that maybe I haven't covered?
Well, I have actually gotten responses from some people who have taken the time to think about things, and they, in one case, have proposed a sales tax as a consumption tax, even though that's, we know, regressive, and the sales tax is regressive. It has a disproportionate impact on people who have lower incomes because it gobbles up a higher percentage of their household income. But that's one idea that's come forward. And
So that reminds me, I don't know if you remember this. God, it was quite a few years ago. One of the ideas was, well, we're going to put a tax on yachts. That was the idea, or big boats. Mm-hmm. And but the outcome was that people just stopped buying yachts and then they ended up having to lay off all the people who worked in the boat building industry, right? So best intentions, it didn't have the outcome they were really after, right? And so that's when I hear these things, that's sort of one of the things that I do worry about. I'm on the thinking about this interview. I was like, well, how do you handle the fact that already some of our biggest employers are right outside the city limits, right? And I'm thinking of like 3M and Best Buy and United Health Group and all that. So all those people who work in the area take advantage of all the services of the city in some ways, but they're paying taxes in Edina or Eden Prairie or Minnetonka or, one of these other suburbs. So how is there a way to kind of get some of these outlier, the visitors, I guess? I mean, I want people to visit the city and feel safe and comfortable and whatnot, but I'm just wondering, is there kind of a larger regional thing that you could do so that this Minneapolis gets more funding? I mean, one of the things I know that, and I don't know where they're at with it, but getting more local government aid from the state, right? It seems like I hear this argument all the time that essentially Minneapolis pays out more in taxes than we get back. Is there a way to change? Well, first of all, is that true? And then second of all, is there a way to kind of rebalance that so that we're getting more back than we're currently giving out?
My understanding is that's true. I think that's not going to change as long as Minneapolis has a dozen or so legislators out of 201. I would love to see the change happen, but over the last 8 years, the city's share of local government aid hasn't changed appreciably, and so I think that's it's a nice to have, but I don't think it's going to happen, and I think we need to be realistic about that. And there's no way for us to cut off the flow of dollars at the city border. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So when candidates kind of talk about, beating the drum for getting more local government aid, you think that's more wishful thinking than?
I do.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I'd love to have it not be true, but.
Well, that was one of my other questions I wanted to ask is, do you, I'm assuming you've been kind of following some of the races in town. Do you think candidates are talking about budgets enough? Because I feel like you don't hear that. It certainly doesn't float up to the top 3 or 4 issues.
Right. I agree with you. I would like to see candidates talking about whether we need a budget review to look at the long-term patterns that have evolved and what spending is still appropriate and what new spending is still appropriate and what old spending needs to be dropped. And I think we need to also maybe have a discussion about different types of budgeting. For example, program-based budgeting, which gets down below the department's silos and looks at the efficacy of programs and their outcomes. And I think that I've heard Councilmember Palmisano, for example, speak favorably of that approach. And I think that when we went to the 2-year budgeting cycle that started under the current mayor, the idea was in the second year they'd spend more time digging deeper into the budget. And I think we need to make sure that happens. And I'd like to see council candidates address how we get deeper into the budget so that we know we're getting our money's worth. That's what we all want.
Yeah. I mean, it is hard when I've tried and research budget issues. Like you say, you can see maybe what the department gets, but it's very hard below that level to know what programs are getting funded and how and, whether they're effective or not. So. All right, so one last question for you, a biking question. You said that you'd been hit by a car. What's this? Can you tell me the story there?
Well,
thankfully, you're still here with us. So
yeah, I've been hit several times. never seriously, but I did have a door flung open when I was biking on a bike lane and a car was illegally parked in it. And I had a choice between going to the left side and the right side. I saw the left side door open, the right side opened right in front of me. It was an Uber driver with a passenger, and I broke a vertebrae. I had a sort of essentially a vertebral dislocation, and so I'm well aware of the issues, and that's why, even though many people don't like bike lanes or see them as superfluous, I see them as a safety issue for me as a commuter, and I do bike to Board of Estimate meetings when the weather is conducive.
Okay, and how long have you been riding a bike?
7 years old, maybe.
Well, I mean, like around the city, commuting kind of thing.
Well, since I moved here, I've gotten steadily more. I mean, my last year and a half, I commuted downtown entirely by bike, with the exception of maybe a dozen times when the weather wasn't right and I took the bus. But last year and a half of my career, before that I was more occasional, but I was always a recreational rider.
My experience downtown is that whether you're walking, biking, driving a car, anything, you have to be careful, right? And now there's the scooters, there's the e-bikes. Like, there's so much coming at you that's going different speeds and are in different lanes, and it's kind of, you have to really just be paying attention to not walk into something.
Exactly, and now they've moved some of the bike lanes up onto the sidewalk level, right next to walking areas. If there's a Vikings game, you have to sort of almost have a horn on your bike to keep people out of your way, and awareness is good.
So I don't mean to keep going on, but that's another thing I just thought about. Like, what about getting some of these stadiums to pay back a little bit more money into the city's budgets, or because the city helped build the stadium, and we could be faced with having to build another one for the Timberwolves. Who knows? I mean, how does the city start getting a little bit better deals on those things where it's paying us as opposed to us paying them?
I think the difficulty we have is that basically a sports team is a monopoly for that particular sport. And I don't think property tax money should be used, and generally it isn't. But I think that the spin-offs from a stadium do generate liquor and restaurant taxes, which there's a legitimate question as to whether you keep the stadium or a proposed new stadium in the city in order to use some of that revenue. I'd like to see it and it is used right now to subsidize the general fund. We're just at the point of paying off, for example, the last payment this year on the convention center downtown, the expansion, and I'd like to see some of that money devoted to the general fund as well. I don't like subsidizing professional sports facilities. My opposition is a little less hardcore if it's only funded by those special taxes, and I'd rather have it be limited to the entertainment, liquor, restaurant sorts of taxes as opposed to the general sales taxes that the people pay when they go to the hardware store, for example. Those revenues definitely we should keep out of the hands of professional sports owners.
All right. Well, thank you for this talk today. It was great. We covered a lot of ground. All right.
Glad to be here.
Bye.